She sat at the same desk every morning, reading manuscripts with quiet focus. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore plain reading glasses that had seen better days. Sandra Williams looked like any other book editor in the small publishing house. Careful, methodical, unremarkable. The young writers who came to submit their work barely noticed her. To them, she was just another middle-aged woman behind a desk, someone who decided whether their stories were good enough. The publishing house wasn't much to look at from the outside. Riverside Publications was painted in faded letters on a brick building that had once been a warehouse. Inside, Sandra's desk sat near the window, where she could watch the river flow past while she worked. She had been there for 3 years now, ever since she moved to this quiet town. She never talked about where she came from or what she did before. When people asked, she would simply say, "I've always loved books." Most days were peaceful. Sandra would arrive at 8 in the morning, make coffee for the small office, and settle into her work. She read everything: romance novels, mystery stories, children's books, poetry collections. Her comments were always helpful, always kind. She had a way of finding the heart of a story and helping writers make it stronger. But she did it all quietly, without fanfare. The other employees at Riverside Publications had grown comfortable with Sandra's presence. There was Maria, the young receptionist who was working her way through college, and James, the layout designer who specialized in creating beautiful book covers. Mr. Rodriguez, the publisher, often relied on Sandra's judgment when deciding which manuscripts to accept. She had an eye for stories that would touch readers' hearts, even if they wouldn't necessarily become bestsellers. Sandra's apartment was a short walk from the office, in a converted Victorian house that had been divided into 4 units. She lived simply. A small kitchen, a living room lined with bookshelves, and a bedroom with a window that looked out over the town's main street. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman who always said hello, but never lingered for long conversations. They didn't know about the framed commendations stored in a box under her bed, or the flight helmet that sat on the top shelf of her closet, gathering dust. Every morning, Sandra walked the same route to work. She passed the bakery where Mrs. Chen made fresh bread, the hardware store run by the Thompson family, and the small park where children played before school. She knew the rhythm of the town, the way the river rose and fell with the seasons, the times when the tour boats would bring visitors from the city. It was a peaceful life, exactly what she had been looking for when she retired from her previous career. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in October. 3 young writers had driven up from the city to pitch their manuscript to the publishing house. They walked in wearing expensive clothes and carrying leather bags, looking around the small office with barely hidden disappointment. Their leader was a man named Blake, probably 25 years old, with perfectly styled hair and a confident smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Is this really the whole office?" Blake asked loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. His 2 friends, Emma and Tyler, snickered behind him. "I thought you'd be bigger." Sandra looked up from her manuscript, but didn't say anything. She had learned long ago that some people needed to make noise to feel important. The publisher, Mr. Rodriguez, came out of his office to greet them. He was a kind man in his 60s who had built this small publishing house from nothing. "Welcome to Riverside Publications," he said warmly. "I'm excited to hear about your project." Blake shook his hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We're here to revolutionize publishing," he announced. "Our book is going to be huge. We just need someone who understands real literature." Emma pulled out her phone and took a picture of the office. "This is so authentic," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't mean it as a compliment. "Like stepping back in time." Tyler was examining the books on display. Are these all local authors? We're looking for something with more scope, more international appeal. As they talked, Blake's eyes wandered around the office. They landed on Sandra, who was quietly working at her desk. "Who's that?" he asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Does she actually do anything important? Or is she just here to answer phones?" Mr. Rodriguez frowned. "Sandra is our senior editor. She's one of the best in the business." Blake laughed. "Really? She looks like someone's grandmother. What could she possibly know about modern storytelling?" Emma joined in. "We need someone who gets it, you know? Someone who understands what readers actually want." Tyler nodded. "No offense, but we're looking for fresh perspectives, not old-fashioned thinking." Sandra kept reading, her face showing no emotion. She had heard worse. In her previous life, she had dealt with people who thought they knew everything. She had learned that the loudest voices weren't always the wisest ones. Maria, the receptionist, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had seen Sandra's editing work and knew how talented she was. "Sandra has helped a lot of authors get published," she said quietly. "I'm sure she has," Blake replied dismissively. "But we're not writing for the same audience as your typical authors. Our readers want action, adventure, real-life drama. They want stories about people who've actually done something with their lives." "I think you should give Sandra a chance," Mr. Rodriguez said carefully. "She has a lot of experience." "Experience doing what?" Blake challenged. "Sitting behind a desk all day? We need someone who's actually lived, someone who's seen action." That made Sandra look up. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, but something deeper. Then she went back to her work. The meeting continued in the conference room, but Sandra could hear them through the thin walls. They talked about their book like it was the most important thing ever written. It was a thriller about young heroes saving the world, full of unrealistic action scenes and characters who never seemed afraid. "The thing is," Blake was saying, "we've actually done research. We've talked to real people, experienced real danger. This isn't just made-up stuff." Sandra almost smiled at that. Real danger, if only they knew. "Our main character is based on actual heroes," Emma added. "People who risk their lives for others. We've studied their techniques, their mindset." "The problem with most action stories," Tyler explained, "is that they're written by people who've never been in a real crisis. Our hero feels authentic because we understand what real courage looks like." Sandra continued editing the children's book on her desk, but she found herself thinking about real courage, about flying into storms when everyone else was grounded, about making split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance, about carrying the weight of responsibility for other people's safety. At exactly 11:30, everything changed. The sound came from outside, a loud crash followed by screaming. Sandra was on her feet before anyone else had even looked up. Through the window, she could see what had happened. A small motorboat on the river had hit something and overturned. There were people in the water, and they were struggling. "Oh my God!" Emma gasped, running to the window. "Someone should call 911." Maria was already reaching for her phone, but Sandra was faster. She was already moving toward the door, her demeanor completely changed. The quiet editor was gone, replaced by someone who moved with purpose and authority. "Call emergency services," Sandra said calmly to Maria. "Tell them we have a boat accident with multiple people in the water. Location is the bend near the old mill." She kicked off her shoes and ran toward the door, grabbing a life ring from the wall. Something most people never noticed was there. "Where are you going?" Blake called after her. "You can't just jump in the river." Sandra didn't answer. She was already outside, running toward the water with long, confident strides that belied her age. The others followed, confused and frightened. The water's freezing, Tyler shouted, and the current's too strong. But Sandra was already at the river's edge, assessing the situation with the trained eye of someone who had seen similar emergencies hundreds of times before. In the river, a family was in serious trouble. The boat had completely flipped over, and there were 4 people in the water, 2 adults and 2 children. The current was strong, and they were being swept downstream fast. The water was cold, and hypothermia would set in quickly. "Help!" the father shouted. "My kids can't swim!" One of the children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, was panicking and going under. Her mother was trying to reach her but was struggling to stay afloat herself. The other child, a boy about 10 years old, was clinging to the overturned boat but losing his grip. Sandra took off her jacket and waded into the water. The shock of the cold didn't slow her down. She had trained in water much colder than this. Without hesitation, she dove into the river. The cold water hit her like a slap, but she didn't slow down. She swam with powerful, efficient strokes that cut through the current like she was born for it. The crowd on the shore grew larger as people heard the commotion. Someone pointed at Sandra swimming toward the struggling family. "Is that the lady from the publishing house?" Blake, Emma, and Tyler stood frozen, watching in disbelief as the woman they had dismissed as irrelevant powered through the dangerous water. Sandra reached the little girl first. The child was panicking, thrashing in the water, which made everything more dangerous. But Sandra knew exactly what to do. She approached from behind, wrapped her arm across the girl's chest, and spoke in a calm, clear voice. "I've got you. Stop fighting and let me help." Something in Sandra's voice made the girl stop struggling. There was authority there, competence, the voice of someone who had done this before. Sandra began swimming toward shore, pulling the child with her, fighting against the current with strength that surprised everyone watching. "She's actually doing it," Emma whispered. But Sandra wasn't done. The moment she got the girl to shallow water where bystanders could help, she turned around and went back for the others. The boy was next, then the mother, and finally, the father. Each rescue was performed with the same calm efficiency, the same perfect technique. By the time the paramedics arrived, Sandra had pulled all 4 people from the water and was performing first aid on the father, who had hit his head when the boat flipped. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking his pupils, monitoring his breathing, keeping him stable. "Ma'am, are you a nurse?" one of the paramedics asked. "No," Sandra replied, continuing her assessment. "But I've had training. He's got a possible concussion, but his vitals are stable. The children are hypothermic but conscious." The family was going to be fine, cold and shaken, but alive. As Sandra sat on the riverbank, water dripping from her clothes, the crowd that had gathered stared at her in amazement. Blake, Emma, and Tyler stood off to the side, their mouths hanging open. "How did you know how to do that?" Blake asked quietly. Before Sandra could answer, an older man pushed through the crowd. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a Coast Guard baseball cap and walking with the confident bearing of someone used to command. "Sandra Williams," he said, and his voice carried authority. "I thought that was you." Sandra looked up and smiled for the first time that day. "Hello? Commander Patterson." The old man turned to face the crowd. "This woman," he said loudly, "is Captain Sandra Williams, retired Coast Guard. She flew rescue helicopters for 22 years. She's saved more lives than most people have met." A murmur went through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Coast Guard helicopter pilot?" Commander Patterson continued, "She flew missions in hurricanes at night, in conditions that would terrify most pilots. I personally watched her pull 6 fishermen from a sinking boat in 8-foot seas during a storm that had grounded every other aircraft." He looked directly at Blake. "You want to know about real danger, Real action? Sandra here flew into Hurricane Katrina when everyone else was flying out. She saved 43 people in 3 days. The commander's voice grew stronger. She never talked about it, never bragged. That's not her way. But when the Coast Guard needed their best pilot for the most dangerous missions, they called Sandra. Sandra stood up, wringing water from her hair. That's enough, Commander. No, it's not, he said firmly. These young people need to understand what real heroism looks like. It's not loud, it's not flashy. It's a woman who reads books all day and jumps into a freezing river when people need help. Blake stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment. Sandra, we didn't know. I'm sorry for what I said. Sandra looked at him for a long moment. You don't need to apologize for not knowing my history. But you should apologize for assuming that quiet people have nothing to offer. Emma spoke up, her voice small. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something when we were being so rude? Because, Sandra said simply, what I did before doesn't make my opinion about your book any more valuable. A good editor judges stories, not resumes. Tyler shook his head. But you've actually lived the kind of life we're writing about. You could help us make it real. Sandra squeezed water from her sweater. Maybe. But first, you need to understand that real heroes don't spend their time talking about being heroes. They just do what needs to be done. The paramedics had taken the family to the hospital for observation, but they were all conscious and talking. The little girl had waved goodbye to Sandra with a smile that made everything worthwhile. As the crowd began to disperse, Mr. Rodriguez appeared with a towel and a thermos of hot coffee. I called your apartment, he said. Your spare clothes are on the way. Thank you, Sandra said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Blake approached hesitantly. Sandra, would you be willing to read our manuscript? Really read it, I mean, and tell us what you think? Sandra studied his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine respect. I'd be happy to. But I'll tell you the truth. Even if it's not what you want to hear, that's exactly what we need, Emma said. Commander Patterson lingered as the others headed back to the office. You know, he said quietly, I always wondered why you retired so young. You were the best pilot we had. Sandra looked out at the river, now calm again. I saved a lot of people, Commander, but I couldn't save everyone. After a while, the weight of that becomes too much to carry in the cockpit. He nodded. And now? She smiled. Now I help people tell their stories. It's a different kind of rescue, but it matters too. As they walked back to the office, Sandra could hear Blake talking to his friends. Did you see how she moved in the water? Like she'd done it 1,000 times. She probably has, Tyler replied. And the way she stayed calm, Emma added. When everyone else was panicking, she just acted. Sandra dried her hair with the towel Mr. Rodriguez had brought. In a few minutes, she would change into dry clothes and go back to her desk. She would read Blake's manuscript and give him honest feedback. She would help him understand that real heroism wasn't about being perfect or fearless. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when you were scared. The news of the rescue spread quickly through the small town. By evening, Sandra's quiet life had been turned upside down. The local newspaper wanted to interview her. A television station from the nearest city had sent a crew. But Sandra politely declined all requests for interviews. I was just in the right place at the right time, she told the persistent reporters. But the people of the town saw it differently. Word spread about her Coast Guard service, about the years she had spent risking her life to save others. The quiet editor they had barely noticed was suddenly someone they looked at with new eyes. The next morning, Sandra arrived at her usual time and made coffee for the office. Blake, Emma, and Tyler were already there, waiting for her with their manuscript. They looked nervous but hopeful. "We spent all night talking about what happened yesterday," Blake said, "and about what you said. We realized our book is all wrong." Sandra poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at her desk. "Tell me what you mean." Emma leaned forward. "Our hero is too perfect. He never fails, never gets scared, never makes mistakes. After watching you yesterday, we understand that real heroes are human." "You were afraid," Tyler observed. "I could see it in your eyes before you went into the water. But you did it anyway." Sandra nodded. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear because someone needs help." "We rewrote the opening," Blake said. "We tried to make the hero more real." Sandra accepted the pages and sat down at her desk. As she began to read, she noticed something different in their writing. The main character wasn't invincible anymore. He was afraid sometimes. He made mistakes. He was human. "This is much better," Sandra said after reading the first chapter. "Your hero feels like a real person now." Emma leaned forward eagerly. "We were thinking about what you said, about how real heroes don't spend time talking about being heroes. And we realized," Tyler added, "that our original hero was all talk and no substance." Blake nodded. "We want to write about real courage, the kind you showed yesterday." Sandra looked up from the manuscript. "Courage isn't just about dramatic rescues. It's about everyday choices. The nurse who works extra shifts during a flu epidemic. The teacher who stays late to help struggling students. The neighbor who checks on elderly people during a heat wave." "Is that what you thought about?" Emma asked, "when you were flying rescue missions?" Sandra considered the question carefully. "I thought about the people who were counting on me to bring them home. That made everything else secondary." She went back to reading their story. In the margin, she made a note. "Good. Your hero is thinking about others, not himself." As the morning progressed, Sandra worked with the three young writers to improve their story. She helped them understand that real action came from character, not special effects. That true heroism was often quiet and unglamorous. "The most dangerous mission I ever flew," Sandra told them during a coffee break, "was to pick up a heart attack victim from a fishing boat in the middle of a storm. Nothing dramatic happened. No explosions, no gunfights. Just careful flying in terrible conditions to save one man's life." "But that's still heroic," Blake protested. "Is it?" Sandra asked. "Or is it just doing the job I was trained to do?" Tyler thought about that. "Maybe heroism isn't about being special. Maybe it's about being prepared when ordinary people need help." Sandra smiled. "Now you're starting to understand." By lunchtime, they had completely restructured the opening of their book. The new version was quieter, but more powerful. The hero wasn't a superhuman figure. He was a regular person who stepped up when others needed help. "This feels right," Emma said, reading over the revised pages. "It feels true." Commander Patterson stopped by the office around noon. He had brought copies of old Coast Guard newsletters featuring Sandra's missions. "Thought you might like to see these," he told the young writers. The newsletters were full of stories Sandra had never talked about. Rescues in hurricanes, medical evacuations from ships at sea, searches for missing aircraft. In every story, Sandra was mentioned briefly, professionally. No drama, just facts. "Hurricane Isabel, 2003, the commander read aloud. "Captain Williams executed 14 separate rescue missions in 36 hours, saving 42 lives despite sustained winds of over 100 miles per hour." Blake looked up from the newsletter. 14 missions? In a hurricane? "That was a busy week," Sandra said quietly. "Here's another one," Commander Patterson continued. Ice Storm Rescue, Lake Superior, 2005. Captain Williams and her crew located and extracted 7 ice fishermen trapped on a breaking ice floe in zero visibility conditions. Emma shook her head. And you never talked about any of this? It was my job, Sandra replied. You don't brag about doing your job. She never told us about any of this, Blake said, looking through the papers. Sandra doesn't tell people about her service, the commander explained. She shows them through her actions. Tyler was reading about a particularly dangerous mission. This one says you flew into a blizzard to rescue a family stranded in the mountains. The report says no other aircraft could operate in those conditions. Sandra shrugged. The weather was challenging, but the family needed help. We found a way to make it work. Challenging? Commander Patterson laughed. Sandra, you flew in conditions that grounded military aircraft. The wind shear alone should have been impossible to navigate. We had good equipment and a skilled crew, Sandra said. That makes all the difference. That afternoon, Sandra finished editing their manuscript. Her comments were detailed and helpful, focusing on character development and realistic action. But more than that, she had helped them understand what they were really trying to write about. Your story isn't about someone who's perfect, Sandra explained. It's about someone who chooses to help others, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Emma nodded. Like you did yesterday. Like anyone can do, Sandra corrected. You don't need special training to be kind. You don't need a uniform to stand up for what's right. Blake looked thoughtful. But the training helps, doesn't it? When something really dangerous happens, training gives you tools, Sandra agreed. But the decision to use those tools comes from somewhere else. It comes from caring about people more than you care about your own comfort or safety. As the day ended, the 3 young writers prepared to return to the city. Their manuscript was much improved, and more importantly, they had learned something about real heroism. Thank you, Blake said, shaking Sandra's hand. Not just for helping with our book, but for showing us what courage really looks like. Sandra smiled. You already had courage. You just needed to understand where to find it. Emma hugged her. Will you read our next book too? If you write one worth reading, Sandra replied. After they left, Sandra returned to her desk and picked up another manuscript, a children's book about a shy girl who becomes a hero. As she began to read, she thought about the day's events. The family from the river was fine. The children would have a story to tell their friends. The young writers had learned something important about storytelling and life. And tomorrow, Sandra would be back at her desk, quietly helping authors find the truth in their stories. Through her window, she could see the river flowing peacefully past. A few boats moved slowly across the water, their passengers unaware of yesterday's drama. Life went on, as it always did. Mr. Rodriguez approached her desk. I heard from the hospital, he said. The family you saved wants to thank you personally. Sandra shook her head. That's not necessary. I'm just glad they're okay. Sandra, he said gently, you saved 4 lives yesterday. It's okay to let people thank you. She looked up from the manuscript. I spent 22 years being thanked by people I'd rescued. It never got easier to accept. Why not? Sandra was quiet for a moment. Because I was just doing my job. The real heroes were the people who stayed calm while they waited for help to arrive. That evening, Sandra walked home along the river path. The air was cool and clean, and the setting sun painted the water gold. As she walked, she thought about the young writers and their story. They would write better now, she was sure of that. They had learned that real heroes weren't characters in action movies. They were ordinary people who chose to act when action was needed. A jogger passed her, breathing hard. A couple walked by with their dog. Normal people living normal lives, any one of whom might become a hero if circumstances demanded it. That was the truth Sandra had learned over the years. Heroism wasn't rare or special. It was always there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The next few days brought more attention than Sandra was comfortable with. The story of the rescue had spread beyond the local newspaper. A major news network picked it up, and suddenly Sandra found herself fielding calls from producers who wanted to feature her story on television. Coast Guard hero saves family, read one headline. Retired pilot's daring river rescue, said another. Sandra declined every interview request. She had lived most of her career in relative anonymity, and she preferred it that way. But the people in town had a different perspective. Mrs. Chen from the bakery brought Sandra a loaf of fresh bread. "For the hero," she said with a smile. Sandra protested. "I'm not a hero, Mrs. Chen. I just helped some people." "That's what heroes do," the older woman replied. "They help people." Mr. Thompson from the hardware store refused to let Sandra pay for the small repair she needed for her apartment. "Heroes don't pay retail," he said with a grin. Even the children in town looked at Sandra differently now. They would point and whisper when she walked past. "That's the lady who saved the people in the river," she heard one child tell another. Sandra found the attention overwhelming. She had chosen her quiet life deliberately, after years of high-stress situations and constant responsibility for other people's lives. The last thing she wanted was to be thrust back into the spotlight. But there was one piece of attention she couldn't avoid. The family she had rescued wanted to meet her properly. The Hendersons, that was their name, came to the office on Friday afternoon. Tom and Lisa Henderson, with their children, Sarah and Michael. Sarah was the little girl Sandra had rescued first, and Michael was the boy who had been clinging to the boat. "We wanted to thank you properly," Lisa Henderson said, tears in her eyes. "You saved our children's lives." Sandra knelt down to Sarah's level. "How are you feeling?" "Good," Sarah said shyly. "I'm taking swimming lessons now. Mommy says everyone should know how to swim." "That's very smart," Sandra agreed. Michael stepped forward. "I want to be a hero like you when I grow up." Sandra smiled. "You can be a hero right now, Michael. Heroes are people who help others. You don't have to wait until you're grown up." Tom Henderson shook Sandra's hand. "We can never repay you for what you did." "You don't need to repay me," Sandra said. "Just take care of each other and maybe help someone else when you get the chance." The family brought Sandra a scrapbook they had made, filled with pictures and thank you notes. Sarah had drawn a picture of Sandra pulling her from the water, with the sun shining down and everyone smiling. "We'll never forget what you did," Lisa said. After the family left, Sandra sat at her desk, looking at the scrapbook. The pictures and notes brought back memories of other rescues, other families she had helped over the years. She had a box at home filled with similar thank you letters, all from people whose lives had been touched by her work. That weekend, Sandra attended a small ceremony at the Coast Guard station. Commander Patterson had arranged for her to receive a Civilian Service Award for the river rescue. Sandra didn't want to go, but the commander had insisted. "You represent the best of Coast Guard values," he told her, "even in retirement." The ceremony was simple and brief. Sandra accepted the award with grace, but made sure to mention the paramedics, police officers, and bystanders who had helped that day. "Rescue is always a team effort," she said. "I just happened to be the one who got wet." The audience laughed, but they also understood the deeper truth in her words. After the ceremony, a young Coast Guard pilot approached Sandra. "Ma'am, I've read about your missions. You're kind of a legend in our unit." Sandra smiled. Legends are stories that get better each time they're told. I was just a pilot who did her job. But you inspired a lot of us, the young pilot said. When we're facing difficult conditions, we ask ourselves, what would Captain Williams do? That stopped Sandra for a moment. She had never thought about her legacy in those terms. I'd tell you to trust your training, care about the people you're trying to save, and never give up as long as there's still hope. That's exactly what our instructors tell us, the pilot replied. The young pilot, whose name was Lieutenant Jennifer Torres, continued talking with Sandra after the ceremony. I've read every mission report you filed, she said. Your approach to dangerous weather conditions changed how we train pilots. Sandra was surprised. I just wrote what happened. But the way you analyzed risk factors, how you managed crew resources under stress, it's all part of our curriculum now, Lieutenant Torres explained. You probably don't realize how many lives you've saved indirectly through the pilots you've trained and influenced. As Sandra drove home that evening, she thought about inspiration and legacy. She had spent her career focused on immediate goals, the people who needed rescuing, the missions that needed to be completed. She had never considered how her actions might influence others. Maybe that was another lesson for the young writers. Heroes didn't set out to be inspiring. They just did what needed to be done. And the inspiration followed naturally. Monday morning brought a surprise visitor to the office. A literary agent from New York had driven up to meet with Sandra personally. Word of her story had spread through publishing circles, and several major publishers were interested in her memoir. Your story has everything, the agent said enthusiastically. Drama, heroism, personal sacrifice. It could be a bestseller. Sandra listened politely but shook her head. I'm not interested in writing about myself. But think of the impact you could have. You could inspire millions of readers. I can inspire people right here, Sandra replied, by helping writers tell stories that matter. The agent looked puzzled. You're turning down a potentially huge deal to stay in this small office? Sandra gestured to the manuscript on her desk. This is a story about a woman who started a literacy program in her neighborhood. It's going to change lives, even if it never becomes famous. The agent tried a different approach. What if we focused on the broader themes? Stories of unsung heroes, people who make a difference without seeking recognition. Sandra considered this. That might be interesting, but I wouldn't be the focus. The focus would be on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We could interview other rescue workers, teachers, social workers, people like you who serve others, the agent suggested. Now you're thinking like an editor, Sandra said with a smile. Let me think about it. After the agent left, Sandra found herself considering the proposal more seriously. Not for the fame or money, but for the opportunity to tell stories that needed to be told. Stories about the quiet heroes who made communities stronger every day. Blake called that afternoon with exciting news. We found a publisher for our book, and they want to know if you'd write a foreword about real heroism. Sandra considered it. I'll write something, but it won't be about me. It'll be about what heroism really means. She spent that evening crafting a short essay about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. She wrote about teachers and nurses, firefighters and social workers, parents and neighbors who help each other through difficult times. The heroes in this book, she concluded, are fictional. But the heroism they represent is real and available to anyone willing to put others before themselves. As autumn turned to winter, Sandra's life settled into a new rhythm. The initial attention from the rescue had died down, but something had changed in the way people in town interacted with her. There was a new respect, a recognition that the quiet woman among them had depths they hadn't suspected. More importantly, Sandra found that her work as an editor had taken on new meaning. Writers came to her not just for technical help with their manuscripts, but for guidance on how to write authentically about courage, sacrifice, and service. A retired teacher brought her a memoir about 30 years in inner-city schools. A volunteer firefighter wanted help writing children's books about emergency preparedness. A nurse submitted a collection of stories about her patients' struggles and triumphs. "It's like you've become a magnet for stories about real heroes," Mr. Rodriguez observed. Sandra was editing a particularly moving manuscript about a social worker who had dedicated her life to helping homeless veterans. "Maybe people are ready to hear these stories," she said. "Maybe they're tired of fake heroes and want to read about real ones." The winter brought its own challenges and opportunities for Sandra to demonstrate that heroism wasn't limited to dramatic rescues. When Mrs. Chen slipped on ice outside her bakery and broke her wrist, Sandra didn't hesitate to help run the bakery for 3 days until Mrs. Chen's daughter could arrive from another state. "You don't have to do this," Mrs. Chen protested from her hospital bed. "Of course I do," Sandra replied. "This is what neighbors do." When the Thompson family's youngest child was diagnosed with leukemia, Sandra organized a fundraiser to help with medical expenses. She didn't make speeches or seek publicity. She just quietly coordinated with other local businesses to make sure the family had the support they needed. "How did you know how to organize all this?" Lisa Thompson asked, overwhelmed by the community response. "You learn project management skills in the Coast Guard," Sandra said simply. "It translates to other things." During a particularly harsh winter storm that knocked out power to half the town, Sandra opened the publishing house as a warming center. She coordinated with the Red Cross to provide hot meals and temporary shelter for families whose homes had lost heat. "This isn't part of your job description," Mr. Rodriguez said as they served soup to a line of grateful neighbors. "It's part of being human," Sandra replied. These smaller acts of service went largely unnoticed by the outside world, but they made a profound impact on the people around Sandra. She was becoming the kind of person others turned to in times of need, not because she sought that role, but because she consistently demonstrated reliability and compassion. Spring brought a new project that would test Sandra's commitment to staying out of the spotlight. The state's Department of Emergency Management approached her about developing a training program for civilian first responders. "We need someone with your experience to help design curricula for volunteers," the department director explained. "Your reputation has reached the state level." Sandra was hesitant. "I'm not a teacher, I'm an editor." "But you're also someone who knows how to save lives and how to communicate effectively." "That's exactly what we need." After much consideration, Sandra agreed to consult on the project with one condition. Her involvement would be behind the scenes. She would help design the training materials and review the curricula, but she wouldn't be the public face of the program. The work was challenging and rewarding. Sandra found herself drawing on years of experience to help ordinary citizens prepare for emergencies. She wrote sections on water rescue techniques, cold weather survival, and basic first aid. But more importantly, she emphasized the psychological aspects of emergency response: how to stay calm under pressure, how to make quick decisions when lives were at stake, and how to work effectively as part of a team. "The most important skill in any emergency," Sandra wrote in the training manual, "is the ability to think clearly when everyone else is panicking. This doesn't come naturally to most people, but it can be learned through practice and preparation." The training program launched that summer, with courses offered in communities across the state. Sandra attended the first session, sitting quietly in the back of the room as volunteers learned the techniques she had helped develop. She watched as ordinary citizens, shop owners, retirees, college students practiced the skills that might one day save lives. During a break, the instructor approached her. "Would you like to say something to the class when they find out who helped write this program?" Sandra shook her head. "They don't need to know. They need to focus on learning the skills, not on who taught them." But word spread anyway. By the end of the day, several participants had recognized her from news coverage of the river rescue. They approached her with questions about her Coast Guard service and her experiences. "I heard you saved over 100 people during your career," one young man said. "Is that true?" Sandra considered how to answer. "I was part of a team that saved many people. The exact number isn't what matters. What matters is that we were prepared when people needed help." An older woman raised her hand. "Can you tell us about the scariest rescue you ever did?" Sandra paused, remembering flights into storms that had tested every limit of her aircraft and her crew's abilities. "The scariest ones were when children were involved," she said finally. "When you know that small lives depend on your decisions, the pressure is enormous. But that's also when training matters most. When your emotions want to take over, you have to trust your preparation." A teenager asked, "How did you deal with the stress? Didn't you ever want to quit?" Sandra smiled. "Every difficult job has moments when you question whether you can continue, but then you remember why you're doing it. When you see a family reunited, when you know your actions made the difference between life and death, that makes everything else worthwhile." After the training session, Sandra drove home thinking about the questions the volunteers had asked. She realized that many people saw her career in terms of individual heroics, but the reality had been much different. Her success had depended on teamwork, preparation, and institutional support. She had been part of a larger system designed to help people in crisis. That insight influenced her next project. A publisher from Boston had contacted her about editing a series of books on community resilience, how neighborhoods could prepare for and respond to emergencies. Sandra accepted the project because it aligned with her belief that heroism was most effective when it was shared. The first book in the series focused on hurricane preparedness. Sandra worked with authors who had lived through major storms, helping them tell their stories in ways that would teach others how to prepare and respond. She edited accounts of neighbors helping neighbors, community organizations mobilizing resources, and ordinary citizens stepping up during crises. "This is exactly the kind of book we need more of," Sandra told Mr. Rodriguez as she reviewed the manuscript. "It's not about individual heroes, it's about how communities can work together to protect everyone." The project brought Sandra into contact with emergency management professionals across the country. She participated in conference calls with FEMA officials, consulted with Red Cross administrators, and reviewed training materials developed by state emergency agencies. Her reputation as both a practitioner and a communicator had spread far beyond her small town. But Sandra remained grounded in her local community. When the high school asked her to speak to students about career options in public service, she agreed, with the understanding that she would focus on the many different ways people could serve others, not just on her own experiences. "Public service doesn't require a uniform," she told the assembled students. "Teachers serve the public. So do librarians, social workers, EMTs, and many others. The key is finding work that helps people and communities thrive." A student raised her hand. "But don't you think some kinds of service are more important than others? Like, saving lives is more important than other jobs?" Sandra thought carefully before answering. "Every form of service matters. The teacher who helps a struggling student might be preventing that student from dropping out of school. The librarian who helps an elderly person learn to use the internet might be preventing them from being isolated and lonely. The social worker who helps a family in crisis might be preventing a tragedy. You can't always measure the impact of service, but that doesn't make it less important." Another student asked, How do you know if you're cut out for dangerous work like you did? You don't know until you try, Sandra replied. But you can prepare yourself by developing skills, staying physically fit, and learning to work well with others. Most importantly, you have to be honest about your motivations. If you want to help people, that's a good start. If you want excitement or glory, that's not enough. As the school year ended, Sandra found herself mentoring several students who were interested in careers in emergency services. She helped them research training programs, connected them with current professionals, and encouraged them to volunteer with local organizations to gain experience. One student, Maria Santos, was particularly serious about pursuing a career in search and rescue. Sandra spent extra time with her, explaining the physical and mental demands of the work. "It's not just about being brave," Sandra told her. "You have to be smart, you have to be prepared, and you have to be able to work as part of a team. The lone wolf heroes you see in movies don't exist in real emergency services." Maria nodded seriously. "I've been volunteering with the fire department's junior program. They emphasize teamwork constantly." "Good," Sandra said. "Keep doing that. And remember, the goal isn't to be a hero. The goal is to be useful when people need help." Summer brought an unexpected challenge that would test everything Sandra had learned about balancing her public profile with her desire for privacy. A major television network was producing a documentary about Hurricane Katrina, 20 years after the storm. They wanted to interview Sandra about her role in the rescue operations. "Your story is exactly what we're looking for," the producer explained during a phone call. "An individual hero who made a difference during one of the worst natural disasters in American history." Sandra was reluctant. "I wasn't the only pilot involved in those operations. There were dozens of us, plus ground crews, coordinators, medical personnel." "But you're the one with the most dramatic rescue stories," the producer pressed. "Our research shows you personally saved more people than any other single pilot during the hurricane response." Sandra sighed. She had hoped those statistics would remain buried in official reports. "I'm not interested in being singled out. If you want to tell the story of the hurricane response, tell the whole story, not just one person's part." The producer was persistent. "What if we structured it as a broader story about the Coast Guard response, with your experiences as one example among many?" That approach appealed to Sandra more. After much discussion, she agreed to participate, with the understanding that the focus would be on the institutional response and the teamwork that made the rescues possible. The filming took place at the Coast Guard station where Sandra had once been based. Standing on the tarmac where she had launched so many missions, Sandra found herself remembering details she hadn't thought about in years. "Tell us about the decision to fly into the storm," the interviewer prompted. Sandra looked at the camera, then passed it to the horizon where she had once flown into hurricane conditions. "It wasn't really a decision," she said. "People needed help, and we had the capability to provide it. The only question was how to do it safely." "But weren't you afraid?" "Of course," Sandra replied. "Fear is a rational response to dangerous conditions, but fear can also make you more careful, more focused. The key is not letting it paralyze you." The interviewer asked about specific rescues: the nursing home that had to be evacuated, the family trapped on their roof, the Coast Guard personnel who had to be rescued when their own boat was damaged. "Each rescue was different," Sandra explained. "Different weather conditions, different locations, different challenges. But the approach was always the same: assess the situation, plan the safest possible approach, execute with precision, and communicate constantly with your team." When the interview was finished, Sandra felt emotionally drained. Revisiting those intense days brought back not just memories of successful rescues, but also memories of the people they couldn't reach in time. the difficult decisions about resource allocation, and the physical and emotional toll of working around the clock in dangerous conditions. Commander Patterson, who had also been interviewed for the documentary, found Sandra sitting alone in the station's ready room. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "It's harder than I expected," Sandra admitted. "I don't usually talk about those missions in detail." "You did good," the commander said. "You told the truth about what it was really like, without making it sound glamorous or easy." "That was the point," Sandra replied. "I want people to understand that emergency response is about preparation, training, and teamwork, not individual heroics." The documentary aired several months later. Sandra watched it at home, alone, with mixed feelings. The producers had kept their promise to focus on the broader institutional response, but Sandra's segments were still prominently featured. She found herself cringing at some of her own words, wishing she had expressed certain ideas more clearly. But the response to the documentary was overwhelmingly positive. Sandra received dozens of letters from viewers who had been inspired by her story. Many were from young people interested in careers in emergency services, but others were from ordinary citizens who wanted to become more involved in their community's disaster preparedness efforts. One letter particularly moved Sandra. It was from a high school student in Louisiana whose family had been evacuated during Hurricane Katrina. "I was 6 years old when the hurricane hit," the student wrote. "I don't remember much about it, but my parents told me we were rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter. After watching the documentary, I realized that might have been you or someone like you. I wanted you to know that I'm studying to become an EMT because I want to help people the way you helped my family." Sandra kept that letter in her desk drawer, pulling it out whenever she felt discouraged about the direction of her life or the value of her work. As autumn approached, Sandra faced another decision about her public role. The State Emergency Management Agency wanted to nominate her for a national award recognizing civilian contributions to disaster preparedness. The award would involve a ceremony in Washington, D.C., and significant media attention. "You've done so much to improve our training programs," the agency director explained. "This recognition would help raise awareness of the importance of civilian preparedness." Sandra was torn. The recognition might indeed help promote emergency preparedness, but it would also thrust her back into the spotlight she had worked hard to avoid. After much consideration, she agreed to accept the nomination, but with conditions. She would attend the ceremony, but she would use any media opportunities to focus attention on the broader emergency preparedness community rather than on her individual achievements. The award ceremony was held at the Department of Homeland Security headquarters. Sandra felt uncomfortable in the formal setting, surrounded by government officials and policymakers. But she was impressed by the other award recipients: teachers who had developed innovative safety curricula, community organizers who had built neighborhood response networks, and volunteers who had dedicated thousands of hours to disaster relief efforts. These are the real heroes, Sandra thought as she listened to their stories. People who do important work without expecting recognition. When Sandra's turn came to speak, she kept her remarks brief and focused on the theme of community preparedness. "The most important lesson I learned in my Coast Guard career," she said, "is that effective emergency response depends on everyone doing their part. Professional responders can't be everywhere at once. We need trained, prepared citizens who can help their neighbors until professional help arrives." She continued, "The award I'm receiving today isn't really for me. It's for all the people I've worked with over the years who have committed themselves to making their communities safer and more resilient. The volunteers who staff emergency shelters, the teachers who prepare their students for emergencies, the neighbors who check on elderly residents during storms. They're the ones who make the difference when disasters strike." After the ceremony, Sandra was approached by representatives from several national organizations who wanted to involve her in their programs. A major foundation offered to fund a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in emergency services, with Sandra as the public face of the initiative. "We could reach thousands of young people with your story," the foundation representative explained. "You could be a powerful advocate for public service careers." Sandra listened politely but explained that she preferred to work behind the scenes. "I'd be happy to help design the program and review applications," she said, "but I think the scholarships would be more meaningful if they focused on the recipient's potential, rather than on my endorsement." It was a pattern that would continue throughout Sandra's later career. Organizations wanted to use her name and story to promote their causes, but Sandra consistently redirected attention to the work itself rather than to her role in it. Back home in her small town, Sandra's life gradually returned to its quieter rhythm. She continued editing manuscripts with a special focus on books about community service and emergency preparedness. She volunteered with the local emergency management committee, helping to update the town's disaster response plans. And she continued to mentor young people interested in careers in public service. But Sandra's impact had grown far beyond what she realized. The training programs she had helped develop were being used in communities across the country. The books she had edited were changing how people thought about disaster preparedness and community resilience. And the students she had mentored were beginning their own careers in emergency services, carrying forward the values she had tried to instill. Maria Santos, the high school student Sandra had mentored, was accepted into a competitive search and rescue training program. She sent Sandra a photo of herself in training gear, along with a note. "Thank you for showing me that real heroes are made through preparation and service, not through seeking glory." Another former student, now a volunteer firefighter, wrote to tell Sandra about his first serious emergency call: a car accident on a rural road. "I remembered what you said about staying calm and thinking clearly," he wrote. "It made all the difference in how I was able to help." These letters reminded Sandra that influence wasn't always measured in dramatic rescues or public recognition. Sometimes the most important impact came through quiet conversations, patient mentoring, and the example of a life lived in service to others. As winter settled over the town, Sandra found herself reflecting on the unexpected turn her retirement had taken. She had come to this small community seeking peace and anonymity after a demanding career. Instead, she had discovered that service was not something she could simply set aside. It was too much a part of who she was. But she had also learned that service took many forms. Editing a manuscript that helped people understand important issues was a form of service. Mentoring young people who wanted to help others was service. Writing training materials that would prepare civilians for emergencies was service. Even the simple act of being someone her neighbors could count on was a form of service. One snowy December evening, as Sandra was closing the office after a long day of editing, Maria from the reception desk approached her with a question. "Sandra, I've been thinking about what I want to do after college," Maria said. "I'm studying journalism, but after seeing how you help people through your editing work, I'm wondering if I should consider a different career path." Sandra put down her bag and gave Maria her full attention. "What draws you to journalism?" "I want to tell important stories," Maria replied. "Stories that help people understand what's happening in their communities and the world." "That sounds like service to me," Sandra said. "Good journalism serves the public by providing accurate, helpful information. That's incredibly valuable work." Maria looked thoughtful. "I never thought of it that way." "Every career can be a form of service if you approach it with the right mindset," Sandra explained. "The question isn't what job you do, it's how you do it and why you do it." As they walked out of the office together, Maria asked, Do you ever miss the excitement of your old job? The dramatic rescues and dangerous missions? Sandra considered the question as they stepped into the cold night air. I miss the certainty of it sometimes, she said finally. When you're pulling someone from a sinking boat, you know exactly what needs to be done and why it matters. The impact is immediate and obvious. She paused, watching snowflakes drift past the streetlights. But I've learned that other kinds of work can be just as meaningful, even if the impact isn't as obvious. When I help a writer tell an important story, or when I mentor a young person who goes on to help others, the ripple effects might reach further than any individual rescue. Maria nodded. Like how your training programs are helping people all over the country. Exactly, Sandra said. Sometimes the most important work is the kind that multiplies itself through other people. As they parted ways at the corner, Sandra walked home through the quiet streets of her adopted town. The snow was falling more heavily now, muffling sounds and making the familiar landscape look fresh and clean. She thought about the path that had brought her here, from Coast Guard pilot to small-town editor. It hadn't been the retirement she had planned, but it had been the one she needed. She had discovered that she didn't need dramatic rescues to feel useful. She just needed to be helpful, to be someone others could count on, to use her skills and experience in service of something larger than herself. The next morning brought news that would test Sandra's resolve to stay out of the spotlight. A major hurricane was forming in the Atlantic, and early forecasts suggested it might threaten the East Coast. The National Weather Service was predicting it could be the strongest storm to hit the region in decades. Sandra watched the weather reports with the trained eye of someone who had flown into many such storms. She could see from the satellite images that this was indeed going to be a serious event. As the storm intensified and moved closer to land, her phone began ringing. The first call was from her old Coast Guard unit. Sandra, we're recalling retired personnel with storm experience, Commander Patterson explained. We need every qualified pilot we can get. Sandra felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with preparing for a dangerous mission. But she also felt a moment of hesitation. She was older now, hadn't flown operationally in years. Was she still capable of the split-second decisions and physical demands of storm flying? I'll need a few hours to think about it, she told the commander. The second call was from the State Emergency Management Agency. We're setting up a coordination center for the hurricane response, the director explained. We need someone with your experience to help manage the civilian rescue assets. The third call was from a news network. We'd like you to provide expert commentary on the hurricane response as it develops, the producer said. Your experience would give our viewers valuable insights into what the rescue teams are facing. Sandra politely declined the media request, but told the others she would get back to them. She spent the rest of the morning walking along the river, thinking about what role she should play in the approaching crisis. By afternoon, she had made her decision. She called Commander Patterson back. I'm too old to fly operationally, she said. But I can help with mission planning and coordination. My experience might be valuable in a support role. She also agreed to help with the state's coordination efforts, but insisted on working behind the scenes rather than being the public face of the response. As Hurricane Isabella approached the coast, Sandra found herself back in an environment she hadn't experienced in years, the controlled chaos of a major emergency response operation. The Coast Guard Command Center buzzed with activity as weather updates came in, rescue assets were positioned, and contingency plans were refined. Sandra worked at a computer terminal, analyzing weather data and helping to plan flight paths that would maximize safety while ensuring rapid response capability. Her years of experience flying in storms gave her insights that were valuable to the younger pilots who would actually execute the missions. The wind shear in this quadrant is going to be particularly dangerous, she told a group of pilots during a briefing. Based on the pressure readings, I'd recommend approaching from the southeast and using a spiral descent pattern rather than a straight approach. Lieutenant Torres, the young pilot Sandra had met at the ceremony months earlier, was among those preparing to fly. "It's good to have you here," she told Sandra during a break. "Even if you're not flying with us, knowing you're helping plan the missions makes me feel more confident." Sandra was touched by the comment, but she also felt the weight of responsibility. These young pilots would be risking their lives based partly on her analysis and recommendations. It was a reminder that even support roles carried real consequences. As the storm made landfall, the rescue operations began in earnest. Sandra monitored radio communications from the command center, tracking the progress of multiple missions simultaneously. She heard the tension in pilots' voices as they navigated dangerous conditions, the relief when rescues were completed successfully, and the frustration when weather forced them to abort missions. During one particularly difficult rescue, a family trapped on the roof of their flooded home, Sandra found herself wishing she could be in the cockpit herself. The young pilot was struggling with the wind conditions, and Sandra could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Tell him to adjust his approach angle," Sandra suggested to the flight coordinator. "Come in from due north instead of northeast. The wind shadow from that building should give him a more stable platform." The adjustment worked. The rescue was completed safely, and the pilot's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. "Thanks for the guidance. That made all the difference." Over the next 3 days, Sandra worked around the clock, helping coordinate dozens of rescue missions. She didn't fly a single hour herself, but her experience and judgment contributed to the safe completion of operations that saved hundreds of lives. When the storm passed and the immediate rescue phase was over, Sandra found herself emotionally and physically exhausted. She had been reminded of why she had loved her Coast Guard career: the intensity, the clear sense of purpose, the knowledge that every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But she had also been reminded of why she had chosen to retire. The stress was enormous, the responsibility overwhelming. At her age, she wasn't sure she could sustain that level of intensity for extended periods. Commander Patterson found her in the break room after the operations center had quieted down. "You did good work this week," he said. "The pilots really benefited from your experience." Sandra sipped her coffee and looked out at the dawn sky, clear and calm after days of storms. "It felt good to be useful again," she admitted. "But it also reminded me why I chose a quieter life." "You know," the commander said, "there might be a middle ground. What if we brought you in as a consultant for major operations like this? You wouldn't have the day-to-day responsibilities, but you'd be available when we really need your experience." Sandra considered the offer. It would allow her to continue serving when her skills were most needed, without completely disrupting the peaceful life she had built in her small town. "Let me think about it," she said. The drive home took Sandra through areas that had been heavily damaged by the hurricane. She saw houses with roofs torn off, trees down across roads, and evidence of the flooding that had necessitated so many rescues. But she also saw signs of recovery already beginning: neighbors helping neighbors clear debris, utility crews working to restore power, and emergency shelters providing temporary housing for displaced families. It was a reminder that emergency response was just the beginning of recovery. The long-term work of rebuilding communities was equally important, if less dramatic. Back in her small town, which had been spared the worst of the storm, Sandra was greeted as a returning hero. Word had spread that she had been involved in the hurricane response, and people wanted to express their pride and gratitude. "We saw you on the news," Mrs. Chen said when Sandra stopped by the bakery. "They mentioned that you were helping coordinate the rescues." Sandra was surprised. I asked them not to use my name. They didn't, Mrs. Chen replied, but they said an experienced former Coast Guard pilot was helping with mission planning. Everyone in town knew it had to be you. Over the following weeks, Sandra received numerous requests for interviews about her role in the hurricane response. She declined them all, but she did agree to speak to local groups about hurricane preparedness and the importance of having evacuation plans. The best rescue is the one you don't need, she told a gathering at the town hall. If people evacuate early when they're told to, if they have emergency supplies ready, if they know what to do when disaster strikes, that prevents a lot of emergencies before they happen. A resident asked, "What should ordinary people do to prepare for disasters?" Sandra had given this question a lot of thought over the years. "Start with the basics," she said. "Have a plan for how your family will communicate and where you'll meet if you're separated. Keep emergency supplies, water, food, flashlights, battery-powered radio. Know your evacuation routes, and most importantly, pay attention to emergency warnings and follow them." Another resident asked, "How can we help during disasters if we're not professional responders?" "There are many ways to help," Sandra replied. "You can volunteer with organizations like the Red Cross. You can check on elderly or disabled neighbors. You can donate blood, provide temporary housing, or volunteer at emergency shelters." During the hurricane response last week, some of the most valuable help came from local residents who knew their communities well and could guide rescue teams to people who needed help. As winter returned to the small town, Sandra settled back into her routine at the publishing house. But her brief return to emergency response work had energized her in unexpected ways. She found herself more engaged with the manuscripts she was editing, particularly those dealing with themes of community resilience and civic engagement. She also accepted Commander Patterson's offer to serve as a consultant for major emergency operations. It would mean occasional trips to help with planning and coordination during large-scale disasters, but it would allow her to maintain her primary focus on her editorial work. The arrangement proved to work well. Over the next several years, Sandra was called in to help with responses to major floods, tornadoes, and other disasters. Each time, she contributed her experience and expertise without seeking publicity or recognition. She was becoming known within the emergency management community as someone who could be counted on for wise counsel and practical guidance. But her most important work continued to be the quiet daily tasks: editing manuscripts, mentoring young people, and being a reliable presence in her adopted community. She had found a way to balance her desire for a peaceful life with her commitment to serving others when her skills were needed. One spring morning, as Sandra sat at her desk editing a memoir by a retired teacher, she received a call that would bring her full circle in an unexpected way. "Is this Sandra Williams?" the caller asked. "My name is Sarah Henderson. You saved my life 20 years ago when I was 8 years old." Sandra remembered immediately, the little girl from the boat accident, the first person she had rescued that day that had changed how her town saw her. "Sarah," Sandra said warmly, "how are you?" "I'm doing very well," Sarah replied. "I'm a paramedic now, actually. I just wanted to call and thank you for what you did, not just that day, but for showing me what it means to help people." Sandra was deeply moved. "You became a paramedic?" "Yes," Sarah said. "That day on the river, when you pulled me out of the water, you were so calm and confident. Even though I was terrified, I felt safe because you clearly knew what you were doing. It made me want to be that kind of person for others, someone who could help when things went wrong." They talked for nearly an hour. Sarah told Sandra about her training, her work with the ambulance service, and her plans to eventually become a flight medic. "I've always felt like I owed you something," Sarah said, "not just for saving my life, but for inspiring me to dedicate my life to helping others." "You don't owe me anything," Sandra replied. You've already paid it forward by choosing to serve others. That's the best thanks you could give. After the call ended, Sandra sat quietly at her desk, thinking about the unexpected ways that single actions could ripple through time. She had rescued a frightened child from a river, and 20 years later, that child had become someone who rescued others. It was a reminder that heroism wasn't just about the immediate impact of dramatic actions. It was about the long-term effects of inspiring others to serve. As the afternoon sun streamed through her office window, Sandra returned to her editing work with renewed appreciation for the quiet ways that stories could change lives. Each manuscript she improved, each writer she encouraged, each young person she mentored might go on to inspire others in turn. She thought about the book she was editing, the memoir of the retired teacher. It was full of stories about students whose lives had been changed by education, who had gone on to achieve things their teacher had only dreamed of for them. It was the same pattern she had seen in her own life: service that multiplied itself through others. Sandra smiled and picked up her red pen. There were more stories to edit, more writers to encourage, more quiet acts of service to perform. It wasn't the retirement she had planned, but it was the one that suited her best. She was still rescuing people in her own way, one story at a time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.